Good morning.
Blog Talk Radio.
Good morning. This is your host, Llorraine Neithardt. You've reached Venus Unplugged, and actually I'm 4 minutes off schedule. First time. Okay, that's always interesting. What are we doing here and in this land of Venus Unplugged? Well, for this next couple of weeks, we're continuing to work with fairy tales and how to look at them, and what does fairy tales have to do with love? Everything. We want to live in fairy tales, and people don't really know what that means. Fairy tales are very powerful cultural stories that teach us and guide us. They are the best examples of the collective unconscious, the structure of the collective unconscious. So for several weeks, I worked on the fairy tale of Snow White and shared that with you. Last week we did the fairy tale code. I will finish that up today, and then if we have a couple of minutes, I wanted to read something that I found very fascinating. Well, I find this all fascinating. So, in our lives, we're all affected by the collective unconscious. We don't even know it. We all have complexes. We're ruled by ego and shadow and all these marvelous things of psyche. And tales are a way that psyche, the soul, can be revealed. So for that and that alone, I find this a worthy exploration and use of your time to discover what is your soul, your psyche, or the psyche of those you love. Because when you can understand what it's trying to show you or explore, we get much deeper insight and much deeper love and acceptance, because it's like, wow, man, they're caught in that journey right now. So if I understand the pathology of that journey, not that you're analyzing everybody, because that gets dry and bummy and awful, you're understanding. You know, your depth gives you understanding. And because love is so vast and so misunderstood, it's the ever-living principle of Eros in this world. So, for instance, you're angry at somebody, and you know how that gerbil goes running around your mind again and again and again, and round and around. And it's like, didn't I just think this 30 seconds ago? And then that gerbil turns into honey badger, this killing machine that shifts into the fantasy of my focus. I mean, that is the amazing thing about that animal called the honey badger, which I find quite fascinating. Of course, it's pure mayhem, but I watched this, I think it was on PBS, about the honey badger. This animal is like a force. It's like an archetypal force. It just goes. And I'm looking at it. I'm morbidly fascinated by it, because there's nothing darling about it except the fact that it never gives up, it never gives out, it never gives in. Good God, this thing just goes for it. And then I started to realize, oh, I know what I'm looking at, what has my soul fascinated. It's to show that this is the nature of an archetypal force field. It's just going to go for it. It can't be anything else except that archetype. So that's interesting, I thought. And also, when we fall in love, okay, and then suddenly that hunker burning love that we just think is so marvelous, it gets mean-spirited and critical and, you know, kind of like a granny, you know. He's in a mother complex. They all have to be. And the more we can understand this, I had an incident a few weeks ago. I mean, I've been in this building for feels like centuries at this point, and I'm not a complainer. I can either do something about it or I can't do something. But somebody was throwing cigarette butts, so I called I emailed the manager, and I said, you know, maybe it would be wise to put a notice out and please stop doing that shit. And the manager wrote back, okay, seriously? The wind must be throwing the butts. Well, that triggered the Bronx Contessa in me. And I was going to go after it. It was like, what do you mean, seriously? Who says serious? But due to my training and my 30 years under the influence of Jung, I said, wait a second. She triggered my bitch with it, and we were gonna roll. And I said, okay, take a breath. What is it that's triggering you? And it was, the other person's mother complex. It was attacking, it was opinionated, it was humiliating. It was just in that one word. And we wonder why we have war. So I calmed down. I looked at it, and I just said, okay, she's in the throes of a mother complex. The evil witch has her, and you're not going into it. So I just emailed back, and I said, well, I find it fascinating that the wind would bring 40 cigarette butts to the front of my windows. But I guess you know best. And I left it at that. Then she kind of calmed down. She said, okay, I understand. But that was an incident where we could have made archetypal enemies of one another. And it happens all the time. It happens at work. A person says something, or whoever is our arch enemy in our workplace. Usually, solid of donuts. It's a mother complex. They don't know it. They don't know what they sound like. They don't. When the feminine has the negative animus, she's judgmental. Even the voice changes. It's judgmental. It's opinionated, but it has it on the highest authority. And this is for your own good. And when our loved ones or our children or whomever hears it, if you've got a mother complex, you're going to go after that person. Or you're going to feel like the child being victimized. So these forces are very important to be able to understand. It's going to save you a lot of aggravation. And you'll be able to eventually release that gerbil within your mind because you're going around and around. See, when you're spinning like that, it's almost like how the computer spins when it can't connect to something. Around. Okay, your soul is trying to, give you information that's like, whoa, we're in Complexville. Outsmart, understand, move through. And we always know we're in a complex when we have to be right. But I'm right. Well, that's relative. Is there a right and wrong? Well, in general, there is a right and wrong, but is the right and wrong worse when there could be understanding? When a person always has to be right, guaranteed, they got a miserable world inside of them. Because that's the witch within. Negative mother complex. Goose-stepping through their life. So that's what we're doing here, and that's what has to do with Venus Unplugged, and that's what has to do with making the world, and most of all, our own world, a world of love and understanding and beauty and joy and being able to just get it. And most of all, getting it within ourselves. Really recognizing the price you pay to not know this stuff. And not everybody really can. I mean, I spent 25 years in Jungian analysis. Every Wednesday it was, my religion. I mean, I had no idea I was going to do that. But stuff kept on coming up, and I had to look at it, and then, of course, became fascinated, and blah, blah, blah. And, of course, it certainly helped my mysticism, my psychic gift, because I was even able to understand even deeper what it was that was going on and release people, or at least give them an insight, because we can suffer anything as long as it has meaning. So, I want to just finish up what we were working on last week, which was the fairy tale code. So we went over the different parts that, the fairy tales of the time and space. There is no time and space. They have kind of, it's almost like a one-dimensionality. It's like one dimension. We fill it in. and that no one ever goes mad or gets homesick and has no relationship to his and her family. Very often, the hero or the heroine of the fairy tale, it's their journey, and they're on it. And I had this other thought. I wonder if some of these fairy tales, I would imagine, came from, like, say, an ayahuasca trip or trips where people would take sacred mushrooms and have visions and would be able to tune into the collective unconscious and the collective unconscious. Fairy tales are the fastest way and most proficient way of understanding the way of psyche. So, and there's no dimension of time in fairy tales. There's no one ages. Or that's probably the American dream. No one ages. Fairy tales contain critical information about the operation of psyche, which is what we're all about here. Fairy tales are the purest example of the collective unconscious. And they work very much in the same way as dreams do, that when you're interpreting a dream. It's somewhat different, but like in a dream, if something is coming up, we amplify it. We blow libido into it. We make it bigger. We make it stronger. We focus. And what does that particular symbol mean? And it's clear, that fairy tales are somewhat of an overview of individuation. Individuation is a Jungian term that is the process of becoming whole. So it's a clear overview of the process of individuation because a fairy tale contains a precise overview. As I said before, fairy tales are cross-cultural, but they'll have the same bones, which I think that's pretty astounding. How did that happen? There was no computers that we know of, right? That's pretty awesome in my eyes, okay? And fairy tales give us insights into the changes and reversals of the individuation process. See, we can be progressing and growing, and then suddenly everything goes clunk, and we panic. Oh, my God. I'm back in that depression. Well, there are reversals, and we have to have them. Sometimes we have to go back because there's a treasure in there that we left. We got to go back into it. So it's very interesting. And of course, because the fairy tales don't have all this emotion connected to it, it's easier to understand. So in the fairy tales, and it also explains what the psychodynamics of the psyche is, how these complexes bump up against one another, or it's the structure of the ego and the structure of the shadow. I mean, everybody knows, like, oh my God, that the shadow, that's the villain very often. But there can be a white shadow. Let's say if there's a criminal in the fairy tale. Well, they wouldn't call it a criminal. Call it something else. An opposition, okay? And it's apparently one nasty piece of work, but suddenly it saves the hero or the heroine. That's the golden shadow. That's the white shadow. Within the criminal is that touch of golden wisdom. So we need to understand that we are all, whether we're aware of it or not, in a process of individuation while we're living out our lives. And we live this experience all the time. So when we can start understanding the structure of something, we're then going to get insight, real common sense insight. This is not woo-woo stuff, and this isn't like so deep I can't get it. No, this is real. This is what we're building our reality on. And if you want to be free and you want to be whole and you want to grow and you want to master, this is important. because if we understand what we're looking at, we're not victimized. We're not held children. So when we read a fairy tale, there's something like 700 versions of Cinderella, okay? We pay attention to the details. When you're reading the fairy tale, see what triggers you. Like, oh, man. Like, I found it annoying that Cinderella fell for it 3 times. It's like, not Cinderella, Snow White fell for it 3 times. So I had to go look at that. Okay, so where is that in me that's impatient with folly or mistakes? Got to do it 3 times, got to do it 3 times. I mean, it was a minor disturbance. I didn't flip out over it, but it was like, oh, look at that. So that's my witch within that says, come on, you got to get it. Come on, get it. Move it. Of course. So that's how we look at things. We see ourselves in it. We tell us the stories. So the symbols also in the fairy tale are very, very concise. And the fairy tales represent the archetype in its basic form. And each fairy tale is it's like a closed system. It's a complete story. Not necessary. There may be different versions of it, and that's why in interpretation, there's so many various interpretations. But the most important thing, it's a closed system with one meaning, an essential truth about the psyche and the psychodynamics, structure of the psychodynamics. Okay? So when we start seeing that, and, you may not get it right away. It's something you may feel. It depends on whether you're a thinking type, a feeling type, a sensate type, or an intuitive type. How you're going to look and read the fairy tale. That is what makes the difference. Okay. So part of the approach to the fairy tales is that we, as I said, it's the elements of a single psyche. It's your story. It's the story of one person. Snow White is the story of one person and everything that this person goes through towards consciousness. And all characters in the fairy tale, they all represent, let's say, the ego or the shadow or the anima or the animus. All these, they're all within. That's why it's considered a closed circuit. It's compact. It's all there. That's why you can work on one fairy. You can work on a dream for years until you decode it and understand what it's pointing at. And fairy tales. Now, this is very important. If you read an interpretation of a fairy tale, is the interpretation coming from the masculine perspective, dealing with a man's anima, which is his inner woman, or is it coming from the feminine aspect, as in Snow White, where it's dealing with her animus, the development of becoming whole? Remember in Snow White, the prince did squat. He didn't do anything. This was her journey. There was no saving Snow White in this trick. She falls out of the coffin, and the apple, the poison apple, which is lodged in her 5th chakra, falls out. She finds her voice. It's cool stuff. So we look at it from that, too. And that all the elements of the tale are symbolic. So you're looking at one dimension, abstract, and it doesn't have, it's almost like an Egyptian painting. It doesn't have a depth per se, because we fill all that in. So when you're reading a fairy tale or you're reading an interpretation of a fairy tale, and that's why there can be varied interpretation. Walt Disney's Snow White, that and his Cinderella was really the French tale of Cinderella. And he finished it the way that he wanted. He cut some of it off. He didn't have the kind of brutal ending, but that's very much our culture. On one level, we're constantly watching violence, but we want fairy tales to be nice, clean, and neat, and happy ever after. And so the material is symbolic, so do not take the tale concretely, like this is reality. Or how did they get there? Or how did they do that? Because they just do that. It's like a fairy tale. Just do it. Now, if you're reading a fairy tale and you're trying to interpret it so it makes sense, and now each person who reads the fairy tale interprets according to their own psyche, how they're perceiving. So it's a great insight into how you see things. So if you get stuck and you can't make any sense, most likely you're in a complex, which is cool, because then you realize, like, wow, I didn't think I had one of those. We've all got one of them, several of them, as a matter of fact. And once again, if, let's say, I'm an intuitive type, all right, so I will read a fairy tale and tend to see it, from the intuitive, like the whole perspective. But then if I get caught in the inferior, which is the sensate, which is like, why don't you have to do this 3 times? So I know something's being triggered. I mean, we have all 4 types in us, but we just have one we use all the time. But usually it's the one that we don't use all the time that solves the problem, particularly in fairy tales. So when you read a fairy tale, just notice what irritates you or what are you feeling? And then look at it and start saying, Toliba, look at this. So next week, I am going to go, I thought I was leaving Fairy Taleville, but I think there's way too much really interesting material to be gleaned here. And I am going to do the interpretation with this structure, so it gives you an example of how to work with this, of Cinderella, but I'm not going to use the French version of Cinderella that everybody thinks they know. I'm going to be doing the Cinderella, the Grimm's fairy tale of Cinderella, which is the Ash Girl. So that's very different. But as I was doing research, I love to do research, and also editing my book closet, which is talk about the tasks of Hercules. I've got thousands of books, and it's time to edit and clean and see what I really want and need and what I don't, and pass it on, because that's what's important, clearing things out. It is true. Anytime I know a big change is coming in my life, I have no idea what it is. Okay, I've stopped asking a long time ago. I just know that there's a train a-coming, all right? So I just do something very Saturnian, good old Uncle Saturn. I do something very tedious and something I really don't want to do because I'm scheduled for something. But I was reading in this book on fairy tales, and this author is talking about how the story of Cinderella has many possible interpretations, including the modern feminist one. But Harold Bailey, Bayley, now he was the last century. It's funny to say last century, because I even have his books on symbolism, and I didn't have his book on fairy tales though. In the early years of last century, was the first to see it, this Cinderella, as a story of the soul's transformation, and to connect it to the Gnostic Egyptian and Sumerian myth. That's mind-blowing. I love that. Okay? So there we have it. And included in this story of the soul is Cinderella's bondage to a cruel stepmother, the mysteries of her transformation with the help of her true mother, godmother, and fairy godmother. There's the triple aspects of the divine feminine, and the quest of the prince to find his bride, and finally the celebration of the royal marriage. So the Ash Girl, it's a little different than you know, and that's why I'm choosing that, because we think we know, but then we find out we don't, and then the great adventure begins. So go on my website. Oh, I am also putting up all 16 episodes of Snow White on YouTube. Yay, I think I'm going to do that tonight. And go on the website. You can also download this from Blog Talk, or you can download it from YouTube, and watch your tail. Bye.
Napa know-how.
A Napa guy knows more isn't always better, unless we're talking about full-size vans. These beasts do more than get you from A to B. They have so much space a man can live in it. With shag carpeting, waterbed, and a sweet lava lamp, these mobile abodes have all the comforts of home. With quality parts and plenty of Napa know-how, you can keep the original tiny house running longer, stronger. That's Napa know-how.
Napa know-how.